The title of chapter 5 is Colonial Society on the Eve of the Revolution. And what that means is basically what we're looking at is in this chapter, what the colonies look like just before the revolution started. It's widely believed or recognized, I guess you could say, that the revolution started in 1776. It really did start in 1775, but in most people's minds, they go to July 4th, 1776 with the signing of the Declaration of Independence, but there was actual fighting that went on before that. So we're talking about what it was like at that time. The exact date, not really important, but the eve of the revolution, just before the revolution started in this country, but the population was about 2.5 million. And that was everyone from Massachusetts in the north down to Georgia, the southern part of Georgia in the south. About 90% of the people lived in rural areas. There weren't very many big cities. There were some, and we'll talk about where they were, why they were there. The average age of Americans, 16. So that goes to show you that there's a lot of people having kids. So there were a lot of kids during this time. 16 years being the average means there's a whole bunch of them. Britain ruled 32 colonies in North America, including Canada, Florida, and various Caribbean islands, and there were 13 in where present-day United States is. Obviously, we talk about the 13 colonies, and that's what we'll be looking at right now, is what life was like in the 13 colonies. Okay, so the census, I picked this up through the census website, all this information, so this isn't necessarily from your book, but in 1790, so this is fast forwarding about 15, 20 years from where we are, but it just kind of gives you a feel of what the cities were like. So it was probably a little bit of less than this when it comes to the eve of the revolution, but New York City, 33,000 people, Philadelphia, 28,000, Boston, 18, Charleston, 16, and Baltimore, 13. So those are what your cities look like. I mean, those are small populations today, little towns, but back then that was a big city. One thing that all 5 of these cities have is they're all along the coast. They're port cities. So ships come and go. That's how cities grew. There's a lot of trade going on. There's people there. They're spending their money. They're going to stores. They're staying at inns. They're going to restaurants, the few that there were at the time. But that's where the money was. And then people would build homes, and the dwellings were there. That's how cities started to emerge. And the original cities first are along the coast. When it comes to state figures in 1790, Virginia, surprisingly, was the biggest. And I say surprisingly because we just got done talking about a couple chapters ago how tough the environment was in the South and how you had a good chance of dying early. But remember, 1790, we're talking about 200 years later. So they conquered a lot of diseases. They're now resistant to malaria through survival of the fittest. So yeah, Virginia is number 1, and then Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Massachusetts, and Maryland. Interesting that New York's not up there, even though they have the biggest city, but they'd be 6 on this list. Let's compare that to today's population, just so you have figures and you kind of know, you could compare them. But the United States population today is 327 million people, as opposed to at this time, 2.5 million. And now United States, 327 million. So United States cities today, New York City has 8 million people in it. There were 33,000 in 1790. There's 8 million today. LA 4, Chicago 3. And then when it comes to states, California is the biggest state by far with 39 million people, followed by Texas with 29, Florida with 21. And then for our purposes, just to see what, compare Salinas to what, like a New York City was today, Salinas population is 157,000, by far would have been bigger, way bigger than any one of those original cities in 1790. Just some interesting other facts that I came across. The world's population since the Industrial Revolution. In 1700, the world was home to some 700 million people. 1800, it was 950 million. 1900, there were almost double that number with 1.6 billion in the world. In 2000, quadrupled to 6 billion. And today we're at 7.8 billion people in the world. So I don't know. Sometimes statistics are just, you gloss over them, but those are pretty impressive statistics. So let's talk about immigration, since it's such a huge part of the United States. Let's talk about what it was like on the eve of the revolution when it came to the makeup of the people. 20% of the immigrants in the United States at the time, that's a big number. 20% of the immigrants were forced immigrants. They were African Americans. They were enslaved. Most, but not all of them were enslaved. Most of them in the South. Slavery at this time was illegal in the North. It wasn't yet illegal, but there weren't very many slaves up there. So 20% of the immigrants were African American. The second largest immigrant group in the United States at the time were the Scots-Irish. And I'll talk about the Scots-Irish in the next slide, but they're an interesting group. They're at 7%. The German immigration, 6%. And about 5% of the multicolored population consisted of European groups such as the French Huguenots, or French Protestants, went against Catholicism there. The Welsh, the Dutch, the Swedes, the Jews, the Irish, the Swiss, and the Scots Highlanders. So 60% of the people that settled in the colonies were of English descent. So that means that 40% were other. So just so you understand this, 60% of the people were English backgrounds, 40% were from somewhere else. The largest from somewhere else was the African Americans at 20, and then Scots-Irish. So if you add up all those different groups, those immigrant groups, they would come out to be 40% of the total population. Hopefully you understand that. I'll go over that in class a little bit more too. There were 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence, and 18 were non-English, and 8 were not born in the colonies. So diversity, diversity, diversity. It's what we were built on. It's what we're about today. And it's what we'll always be about. So it goes back to its earliest time. And interestingly enough, if you compare the English colonies to, say, the French colonies or the Spanish colonies at the time, the French colonies only had French people. The Spanish colonies only had Spanish. There isn't a culture of diversity in those places. What's different between English colonies and all the rest of them is the English allowed other people to settle in the English colonies. And you could see it. 60% of the colonies, of the English colonies, were actually English. That number is pretty staggering compared to other countries that had colonies. So I told you I was going to talk about the Scots-Irish. They're a hardy bunch. They're a group that originated from Scotland. And then when the English took over there, they kicked them out of their own country. And they went to, their next homeland was in Northern Ireland. Well, they settled in Northern Ireland, and lo and behold, the British took over that area and kicked them out. So the next place they ended up at, of course, was America. They came across the ocean, and what did they find when they landed on the East Coast? Englishmen. So to get away from the Englishmen that they hated so much, they moved out west, where the roots of the Scots-Irish in the West, back then, today we talk about along the Appalachian Mountains, it's very strong. The Scots-Irish have a strong heritage there. A lot of people that still live there today, their roots go all the way back to this time right here. They're very rambunctious. They are, good fighters. They're tough. They're hardy. You have to be able to live in this area back then along the Appalachian Mountains, because you're fighting Native Americans. You're fighting English. You hate the English. Wild animals. People like Davy Crockett, future President Andrew Jackson, all have their roots, their Scots-Irish roots in them. A couple examples of insurrections by the Scots-Irish were the March of the Paxton Boys, where they rebelled against the Quakers, the Quaker government in Pennsylvania. The Paxton Boys were located, of course, in the western part of Pennsylvania, and they didn't like the lenient policy of the Quakers toward the Native Americans. Remember, the Quakers got along well with the Native Americans, and the Native Americans were attacking the Scots-Irish, and they wanted the government to do something, and of course Quakers would not. So they rebelled. And the same thing with the Regulator movement later on. The Scots-Irish insurrection against North Carolina's a dominating government. They tried to dominate the Scots-Irish and treat them harshly and move them out, and they didn't want to, so there was another rebellion there. So Scots-Irish have a culture, a history of rebellion, and 2 examples right there. Okay, so looking at slavery in America, because, you know, obviously 20% of the immigrants that came to America were African forced immigrants, and most of them were slaves. Slavery in America was harshest in the Deep South. The conditions were tough. The slaves were treated harshly because of the rules that came across from the Caribbean islands that gave slaves no rights whatsoever. If farming tobacco was a bit easier, in New York, there was a slave revolt in 1712, costing the lives of 9 whites and caused the execution of 21 slaves. Another well-known slave revolt was located in Florida, the Stono River Slave Revolt, 1739. 50 slaves tried to march to Spanish Florida, only to be stopped by local militia. So, yeah, there's some examples of slave revolts, but throughout time, slaves have been generally a manageable force with very, very few slave revolts in history. And again, once we get into slavery, we'll talk more about why that was. If you look at the social structure in all the colonies, here's what it was broken down as. The aristocrats were the upper class people. The people who were upper class in the 13 colonies would be lawyers, planters, meaning plantation owners, merchants, and clergymen. It depended on where you were. If you were in the South, we know that there was a planter aristocracy there. If you were in the North, merchants, people who owned stores, lawyers everywhere, clergymen, of course, in the North as well. Any Puritan community, the church leaders called all the shots, and they were at the top of the social structure. The number 2 would be the lesser professional men, those who weren't quite lawyers or weren't quite planters, but made a good wage and lived pretty well. Underneath that would be the largest group, which would be yeoman farmers, hardworking, small farmers that made up the majority of the colonists. And then under that, you'd have manual laborers, which are also known as industrial tradesmen, and then indentured servants and slaves below that, free labor. So that's your colonial structure at the time. And this gives you a visual representation of that, the yeoman farmers in this chart here shown as the biggest group. The most honored profession in the colonies, of course, would be the cloth. If you were in the Christian ministry, especially the Puritan church or the Anglican church in the South. So yeah, and then the most physicians, you know, today we think of doctors as being esteemed and you know, they save people and they are paid well. But back then it wasn't quite the same. There was no medical schools here in America. The medical schools that did exist were located in Europe, and most doctors weren't going to come to America because there's nothing to do for them here. They couldn't spend their money. So most physicians were poorly trained, and you know, they just would follow someone around who said they were a doctor. So, you know, it was tough because there's a lot of reasons that they needed doctors, but they weren't very good. And then you had the lawyers that first were looked down upon, but then when you started talking about purchase of land and issues like that, lawyers were desperately needed. By 1750, lawyers were recognized as useful, and many defended high-profile cases, were great orators, and played important roles in the history of America. Colonial occupations, the number one occupation in all the colonies was farming. Every single one of the 13 colonies, there was some kind of farming. Whether in the North, it was subsistence farms. In the middle colonies, it was food. And in the southern colonies, it was tobacco. So farming was number one. Lumber, because there's trees everywhere along the East Coast. So lumber, making of shipbuilding, those kind of things, sending lumber to England. Fishing was another one, since all of them are along the coast, and then all of them engaged in trade. And there's a map here that shows you all the different industries that were involved. So you could pause it at any time and look and see exactly what industries were involved. And we'll talk about it in class. Now let's look at what the occupations of colonists were in the three individual areas, the north, middle, and south. In the north, your number one occupation, fishing, whaling, and then trade, and then lumber, subsistence farms, and later on, industry. Whenever we talk about industry, it would be like factories that were produced. So trade being huge in the north, there was a concept called triangular trade that would originate in the United States in places like New York, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, where the ships would leave those ports loaded with rum, with guns, with clothing on their way to Africa. Once they get to Africa, as we've talked about before, they'd trade that rum and that cloth and the guns for slaves. The slaves would then come across the Atlantic Ocean on board these ships. We called it the Middle Passage, the horrific journey to the West Indies or South America, and some even to North America. Once they got to the West Indies, they would trade those slaves for molasses and sugar. And then the ship would then go back up to places like New York and New Hampshire and Massachusetts, and they'd trade the sugar and molasses there. And then they'd turn the sugar and molasses into rum, and the whole process would start all over again. It's called triangular trade. It's illegal under English law because under mercantilism, the colonists were not supposed to trade with anybody other than England, but they got away with it. Here's another map that shows you maybe even a better idea of what triangular trade was. It is the orange arrows. You could see the triangle there. The other trade that went on was legal trade between the colonies and the mother country, and that is represented in green. That's legal. The England, the mother country, would go get natural resources from the colonies and then turn around and make manufactured goods out of them. An example of this would be go get a tree, bring it back to England, make the tree into wood to build ships or houses, and a lot more than that. The tobacco would go back to England, and then they would send manufactured goods back. So a lot of trade going on. The orange, illegal; green, legal. In the middle colonies, your number one occupation was farming, and it was farming of food. It's the breadbasket of the colonies, but they also got into lumber because, as I said, trees, trade, fishing, because they're along the coast, and then industry later on. The southern colonies' number one occupation was farming, and it's farming of tobacco, but also rice, sugar, and indigo. The trade that went back and forth, very common, so that was another common occupation, as well as lumber and fishing. So a lot of similarities between them, but some major differences as well. Trade became the lifeblood of the colonies. It's how they made their money. And normally a lot of it was illegal, but because of salutary neglect, because England neglected the colonies, that trade it was allowed to go on. The Americans would, as I said before, provide the raw materials, and then England would provide the manufactured goods. The colonies were supposed to be there for the good of the colony. The colonies were there for the good of the mother country. They would be able to take anything they want. Now, the thing about England is they paid for the trees. They paid for the tobacco. They just didn't take it like some other countries would. England knew that the colonists were trading with other countries and that it was illegal. So instead of knowing that they couldn't stop it, they ended up trying to pass an act in 1733 called the Molasses Act. And it was trying to get some of the action, I guess you could say, from the trade. So they would charge a tax on molasses that England was supposed to get, which they never did. But it's, marks the first time that England is levying any kind of tax on the colonies. That's going to happen quite a bit. When it comes to 1776, what it looked like, or 1775, the religion, the number one religion in all the colonies was Congregational church. And once again, that's the old Puritan church. So obviously you see up here in New England, So you know that New England was where all the Puritans went. And the Congregational Church is the church that they changed it into. That's the name that they called it. So they allowed everybody in. They're about 575,000 strong. The number 2 religion, not surprising, is Anglican. It's the Church of England. It's the church of the mother country. And you had a lot of that in the South. The reason is because they had close ties with England from the South. And also New York had a lot of what they called loyalists, people who were loyal to the British. Underneath that would be Presbyterian. The Scots-Irish were Presbyterian. So that gives you an indicator right there, 410,000 of how many Scots-Irish were actually out there. And then you have some different groups like the German churches and the Dutch Reformed Church and then the Quakers. But down here you see Roman Catholics represented only 25,000, mostly in Maryland, because in Maryland, that was the safe haven for Catholics, as well as Pennsylvania, where the Quakers would allow people to come in. And you see Jews' numbers were really low at 2,000 because it was illegal for them to be there. When it comes to tax-supported churches, meaning that if you paid your taxes, it went to the church, there was no separation of church and state, 2 churches, the Congregational Church and the Anglican Church. All the other ones, they didn't really take your tax money, just those 2 right there.